Yeah, let's go.
All right, let's do it. Martin Dugard, welcome to Built Not Born.
Hey, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's Martin. It is such an honor to have you on. For our listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work, who are you and what do you do?
I'm an author, New York Times bestseller, I think 12 or 13 times top of the list. I'm the co-author of the Killing series, which has sold about 19 million books now. On my own, I've written a series of World War II books called the Taking series, taking Paris, taking Berlin, taking London, and recently taking Midway. And that's what I do.
Martin, what I like to do is get into your creative process, all the epic Killing series books where they just connect the average person to just some amazing narrative history. And but also wanted to focus in on your latest work, Taking Midway. Martin, you describe yourself as a gateway drug for history's casual readers. How did you develop this philosophy and how do you make history so accessible to the average reader?
Thanks. It's a good question. So I've always loved history. I don't know what attracted to me at first, but from a very young age, I found history fascinating. But in college, I took a few history classes. I wasn't a history major or anything, but I couldn't believe how boring the books were and how they took something as exciting as history. You've got pirates and rogues and adventurers and sailing ships and great battles, and how they could take something that exciting and make it so dull. And when I became an author, I started off, I had a corporate job and I was doing freelance writing on the side for magazines. And eventually I left the corporate world and began writing full time. And I worked my way into books just because my kids were getting to the point where I couldn't be traveling 3 months out of the year anymore. And one of the first books I wrote was a history book, and I really began this process of trying to make history as exciting as possible and to make it something that people would turn the pages and really feel like they were there in the moment as if they were reading a great spy thriller. And it's been a literally, that was 1999, I want to say. So it's been about a quarter century, just a process of trying to find ways to make the pace go quicker, make the people turn the pages faster. The same level of high level of detail, the same historical impact. There's a ton of history crammed into these pages, but it's written in such a way that you don't want to you don't want to be reading one of my books at 11 o'clock at night when you go into bed because you may not sleep that night.
It's so true. What I love about your writing style, and I saw it in the Killing series and I see it in the Taking series, it's very distinctive. It's short, punchy sentences. And I love reading your first sentence of each chapter. It's like Adolf Hitler was confused or FDR was having a bad day. Where does that come from? And how did you develop that style?
I stole that just like I do everything. No, you know what? I did a book with James Patterson about 20 years ago, and he's a genius at getting people to read fiction. And one of the things he told me is he always end a chapter with a cliffhanger, and always start the next chapter with something that hits people in the solar plexus. And that's half the fun too, is when I edit, it's going back over that first and last sentence of every chapter to make sure they're as impactful as possible. Because if you finish with a cliffhanger, people are going, maybe I'll turn the page and maybe I'll just read a little bit of the next chapter. And then if you can suck them in right away, next thing they've read another chapter. And if the chapters, and studies show that when people finish a chapter in a book, they get the same dopamine hit from the sense of achievement that they would from doom scrolling on their phone. There's a very deep reaction to that sense of accomplishment. So I want to feed off that and get people moving and get them really loving the book for that reason.
You co-authored like over a dozen books with Bill O'Reilly on the Killing series. And I remember the first one I picked up. Did it start with Killing Lincoln? Is that the first
Yeah,
one you did?
it was first.
And I probably read five or six Lincoln assassination books. And I'm like, there's no shot I'm going to learn anything new in this because I saw documentaries, I read books, I've been to Ford's Theater, and I'm a fan of Bill O'Reilly. So I picked the book up, and it's stuff in there that you've never, like, what sources do you use for books like that? Because you get little facts and backstories and personal stories that you don't see in your average history book. How do you source that?
I use everything. But the one thing I don't do, like when Bill called and said, "Hey, do you want to do a book?" It's about the Lincoln assassination. The one thing I didn't do was read all the other books about the Lincoln assassination because I didn't in any way want people to think I was copying them or ripping them off. And in the process of research, I think I call every book like a graduate degree in history for that specific topic because you immerse yourself in the topic for 9 months to a year, so it becomes all consuming. The best way to research the Lincoln assassination is to research everything around it. Research Abraham Lincoln, research what he wore, what he ate, research the street map of Washington, D.C., research, what kind of horse John Wilkes Booth might have gotten away on, all those little things. So when you take all the outside stuff and I don't do a big file ahead of time. I don't have a mountain of research. I research it sentence by sentence, word by word. So if I have a question about was it raining that day? And if it was raining, were the streets muddy or was there some kind of macadam surface or a gravel? So you ask a lot of questions and then you figure out how much of that information needs to make it on the page. And then you take the stuff that you put on the page and then you take out all the words that don't tell the story. And so that all you have is just action and information.
When you co-author like over a dozen books with, say, Bill, how do you maintain your voice consistently through such prolific output, but having to collaborate? How's that done?
The Killing series is different. And the way it works is I would go in originally with Lincoln. Bill's publisher wasn't sure Bill could do a history book. So when we started doing this, he kind of left me alone for a few months just to see what I came up with. But then the process was I would research, I would write, and then I would send a chapter to Bill, a completed chapter, not just a rough chapter, but a very polished, everything perfectly spelled, everything punctuated, and it would be completely in my voice. And I would send it to Bill, and then we would shift it and put it into his voice. And Bill has a great sense of story, so it was nice to have a partner in those things, and he would say, "We need more of this, we need less of this," and so it became a very good hybrid of his storytelling skills and his voice, and he knows his voice very well. And literally, we would get on the phone and we would go over every word in every chapter until it was just perfect. And then we would end that chapter, move on to another one. And we did that for 15 years. And it was a very involved process. It's one of those things, too, where we're in different time zones. So every now and then our schedules would conflict. And I've edited these chapters in the high school parking lots for track meets when my kids were in school. And one time I was in Guam after we finished the book about the end of World War II in the Pacific, and I did the final edit in the bathroom of our hotel room in Guam because it was 2 a.m. in Guam, where it was the middle of the day back in New York for Bill. And so I didn't want to wake up my wife, so we edited for 2 hours from halfway around the world.
Wow, that is remarkable. It's so cool. And I could speak to the time change where my company's based out on the West Coast. And when we go out there, it's hard even to call home because when you're eating dinner, they're sleeping, like the kids are in
Yeah,
school. And then when you're ready to go to bed, they're eating dinner. Like it never matches up. That time changes. It makes it difficult, doesn't it?
it does.
So let's get to the book, Taking Midway. Here's one. In your notes, you mentioned that Churchill was actually excited when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because it meant England was no longer alone. How do you think that counterintuitive idea that Churchill had shaped the broader war?
You have to remember that when Pearl Harbor happened, Britain had already been at war for almost 2.5 years by themselves. The French had been out since May of 1940, and it was England stood alone. There was a strong isolationist movement in the United States that kept Roosevelt from entering the war before Pearl Harbor. There were neutrality acts that forbid us from giving certain arms or assistance to Great Britain. In England, it's an island nation, so it doesn't have resources. It was only a matter of time unless somebody came in to really champion England and provide assistance that the Nazi regime could just choke them out. They'd be deprived of coal and steel and rubber and all the resources it takes to fight a war, gasoline, And so when we came into the war, Churchill was understandably enthusiastic. He was at Chequers, which is the prime minister's residence in the countryside. It was the house smelled like Christmas because of all it was decorated for Christmas. The Christmas tree was up. But until it happened, he was in a very black mood. And he got the news and he immediately wanted to call Roosevelt and just get things moving, get Roosevelt to declare war.
Midway. People call it the turning point of the Pacific War. You write the most decisive naval engagement of World War II. For the average reader that doesn't know much about Midway, how would you describe the importance of that battle and what it meant to the broader war?
Yeah, I would tell people think of it as the first big battle after Pearl Harbor. There was a lot of fighting between December 7th, 1941 and Pearl Harbor and June 4th, 1942, which is Midway. There was a lot going on in the Pacific, but there was no great strategic engagement that was defining in the way that Pearl Harbor had been defining. And the reason Midway is called Midway is because it's exactly halfway between Tokyo and San Francisco. And for years, we had designs on Midway. Japan had designs on Midway because it was such a pivotal strategic location. And the bottom line is, if people remember one thing about the Battle of Midway, is that if we had lost and the Japanese had taken Midway, they would have been in a perfect position to launch a completely destructive second raid on Pearl Harbor, which was the home of the U.S. fleet. And if they had done that, if they had launched from Midway and knocked us out of, we would have been completely out of the war in the Pacific. It would have been a Japanese lake all the way from Pearl Harbor, all the way back to Singapore. The U.S., we would have been out, and Japan would have controlled literally half the world. And so it was vitally important that we win at Midway.
And all of this hinges on an intelligence breakthrough. You call it one of history's greatest intelligence coups by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Roquefort. Rochefort, you describe that and his code breakers, what they did and how important those code breakers were to the Battle of Midway?
Yeah. You have to remember too, when we think of military intelligence, the idea of code breaking and using all sorts of brain power, it was counterintuitive. You think about it this way, some of the ships that the original aircraft carriers in the U.S. fleet used homing pigeons. There were actually pigeon coops on the ships to send messages. So that's how antiquated a lot of our thinking was. And so when naval intelligence began code breaking and using radio transmissions and all the different little tricks of the trade that the intelligence people had, a lot of people still didn't trust it. A lot of the old upper guard didn't really think that it was solid. Like the evidence, like they couldn't put their fingers on the evidence, so they didn't trust it. And Joe Rochefort and his team of code breakers, they worked in a basement in Pearl Harbor, just a very nondescript doorway leading, I think, 13 steps down into a basement. They called it the dungeon. There was a computer mainframe, the old school computer. We had to feed punch cards into it. But for the most part, these guys, these eccentrics, sat at their desk with a mountain of radio transmissions in front of them, and they would sit there. Everybody smoked. So cigarette smoke, cigar smoke, cigar pipe smoke. And they would sit there in this room with no ventilation for hours and hours, drinking bad coffee and looking at scraps of paper and figuring how those scraps of paper fit into the Japanese code and how could they crack that code. And the Japanese code at the time was so incredibly elaborate, just millions of different combinations for any different word, that the fact that these guys did it, and it took them months and months of just puzzling over these things, turned the tide of the battle. Because when Admiral Nimitz went to Rochefort to say, where is this battle going to take place? When's it going to take place? He had all the answers for him.
And how that unfolds is amazing. And I love in the book, you mentioned there's a sign above a code breaker's desk. It said, "You do not have to be crazy to work here, but
Yeah,
it helps."
yeah.
How do you find these like little human details and that just brings this history to life? Like, where do you find something like that?
You just dig. I don't have a research assistant, but I've got a really curious mind, and so it's like I just don't let go of a fact. And sometimes, if you half-ass it, if you put a fact on the page, but it's not completely the best version of that fact, it doesn't go deep enough, the reader can tell. So it's my job to keep digging and digging until what I put on the page is completely 100% not just accurate, but the best possible explanation about what the reader wants to know.
You also write about censorship and propaganda that was so big for the Battle of Midway on both sides. Like the Yorktown wasn't really sunk, but was portrayed to be sunk. How does the information and disinformation play in the Battle of Midway? How did you see the importance of that? And how would you tie it to the present day disinformation that we put out there?
Oh, do you mean military
Yeah.
disinformation then and now?
Yep.
It's different. You think about it. So, Yorktown, the Battle of Coral Sea was holed. A bomb went down through the flight deck, exploded a few levels down, a few decks down, and it limped back into Pearl Harbor, which is quite a distance, almost from the coast of Australia all the way back into Pearl Harbor, trailing an oil trail all the way through it. And in modern times, if that had happened, there would have been radar, there would have been the capability, satellite capability to know that the Yorktown had been hit and that it was trailing oil, which means it was really having trouble keeping its engines turning, and then it was going back into Pearl Harbor. The Japanese, we didn't have that technology back then, so the Japanese didn't know that they thought the Yorktown had been sunk. When their fighter pilots, when their bomber pilots flew away after dropping a bomb in it, they thought for sure they had sunk it. And so when the Yorktown gets back into Pearl Harbor, they fix all the damage in 48 hours, which is just amazing. It was supposed to have taken 3 months. And then all of a sudden it shows up at the Battle of Midway. The Japanese were shocked. A lot of the pilots who flew at Coral Sea were also flying off the same carriers, were flying at Midway. So when they saw the Yorktown, it was like seeing a ghost.
Wow. And then when that popped up, it was like, yeah, they were, I think you wrote that in the book. It was almost like they were seeing a ghost when it showed
Yeah.
up. That's wild. And the two main antagonists in the book are Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Yamamoto. How would you describe their leadership styles and how would you differentiate
Oh,
their strategic thinking during the war?
both of them were undeniably geniuses. They were really good at what they did, but Yamamoto was a different kind of guy. He was a shorter, squatty guy. He was a gambler who was known for loving high stakes games of chance. His he was his his love interest was a geisha as a woman of the night, and he that was his confidant. And on the other hand, you have Nimitz, who is relying on Rochefort to give him the right information. Nimitz is he's not a gambler, but he's bold. He has courage and he's willing to take a shot, but he needs to know that he's got all the information to do it properly. Very much a family man, had to leave his wife. Like when Roosevelt told him he was going to command the Pacific Fleet, he said, go there and win the war. Nimitz knew he was not going to come back to Washington, D.C. probably for 5 or 6 years. And it's not like now where there's a little R&R break where you can fly off someplace and meet your wife. It was like, goodbye, I'll see you when the war is over. So he was completely focused on winning the war, but to the point that it cost him. Nimitz was such a nice guy. He was a very powerful guy, but at the same time, he suffered sleep disturbances and stomach troubles because of all the weight he was carrying throughout the Pacific battle.
Yeah, just can you imagine how much was the pressure was on both of them?
Yeah.
It's just the weight of the world, literally. You write that Midway, it was not just a turning point of the war, but the moment when the British Empire gave way to the American Empire. Can you elaborate on this geopolitical shift and how this played out in this battle?
It was really accentuated later in the war as the war in Europe was ending and Churchill was doing his best to keep Great Britain as one of the three powers along with the Soviet Union and the United States. But you remember at the time throughout the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, I should say, everything was about naval power. And Britain was the nation that sent it ships around the world. So in the process, they claimed all these land masses for themselves, and they became colonies. And that's one of the ways that Great Britain grew as a nation. They had colonies in India, they had colonies in Australia, and in Singapore. And what happened was, especially with the Battle of Singapore, when the British lost that fortress, and that was their big naval outpost at the western part of the Pacific. Once they lost that, that effectively took the British completely out of the Pacific. They still had a little bit of a bastion with Australia, but once they were there, they lost those colonies. And then as the Japanese began making inroads into India, they were on the verge of losing that too. And Britain just wasn't big enough anymore to be that nation that was the dominant world power. But we were. When you think about it, at the start of the Second World War, the United States had, I think, eight, when it off the top of my head, eight carriers. We built 35 aircraft carriers during World War II, which, in addition to building planes and trucks and other kinds of ships and submarines and, you know, getting uniforms for men and all those kinds of things, the might of the U.S. was just overwhelming compared to what with Britain. And literally, the Battle of the Pacific was when Great Britain left the stage as the world's dominant power.
Yeah, man, such a big turning point in modern history. In the book, you also mentioned a few times the Europe first strategy made the Pacific War much more difficult. How did the Europe first factor into making the Pacific War play out maybe a little more different than if it was the other way around?
First of all, you had the European continent. We are a nation of immigrants, and at the time, a lot of the people had come from Europe. And then you have this guy Adolf Hitler, who's not just has not just conquered almost all of Europe, but he's shooting the civilians. He's rounding people up and sending them to camps, and he's imposing his will. He's had his own version of "Make Germany Great Again." You have this fascist superpower that is for Americans. That's their idea of modern civilization, where the churches, the museums, the cathedrals, all that was Europe. That kind of represented what the world was about. We didn't know anything at all about the Orient. We didn't know about Midway or Hawaii or Tahiti. Those were tropical locales. People didn't even go on vacations that far back then. But so Europe represented the true battle for good and evil. And but again, the fighting had to go on in the Pacific at the same time. That's why it started as a naval engagement, and it wasn't until later in 1942 when we began the process of island hopping, going to the Solomons, then up inevitably all the way to Tokyo.
You mentioned Wake Island, and you describe it as utterly forgotten in the book compared to Pearl Harbor. Like everyone knows Pearl Harbor. Even if you don't know history, people know what Pearl Harbor is. Why do you think some battles capture the popular imagination and just each generation learns about it? But something like Wake Island, I never heard of. Reading all the World War II books and watching the History Channel, never heard of Wake Island. Why do you think some battles stay in the popular imagination while others fade?
I've never been asked that question before. That's a really great question. I would say first of all, the thing about Pearl Harbor was we were humiliated, and America is not used to being humiliated. So we had the country of Japan, which we thought was incredibly inferior. We didn't see them as a threat, even though they were one of the greatest naval powers in the world at that time. But when we thought of Japan, we thought of it as this subservient nation that the products they exported were of inferior quality. We just didn't think of them as our equal. And I'm sure there was a fair bit of racism that went along with that. So when you have this nation that they come in and they don't just drop a few bombs on our fleet as it lies at Anchorage in Pearl Harbor, they sink battleships. Battleships were at the time were the epitome of sea power. So we have all of our battleships lined up and the Japanese sent them to the bottom of the harbor. That was an utter humiliation. They made a lot of mistakes there. They didn't hit the petroleum reserves. If they had bombed the petroleum reserves in addition to the battleships that day, we would have really been vulnerable. That was a bad thing. But then you take Wake Island, it was hit later on the same day. Wake is not very big. It's kind of a wishbone shape. It's way in the middle of nowhere. But we had Marines there. We had a naval component there. We had pilots there. And what happened to them was just hideous because not only did we not rescue them, we actually recalled the aircraft carriers that were on their way to get them. We let these guys be taken prisoner. And the bottom line, most of them either spent the rest of the war in a POW camp at hard labor, or some of them were just machine gunned by the Japanese later in the war after they had helped construct new facilities on there. But I will say this, if you want to, I don't know if you remember in Pulp Fiction, there's the scene where Christopher Walken talks about the watch.
That's crazy.
So the watch, he mentions the Battle of Wake Island in there.
That's right.
And the dad takes that watch and puts it in a safe place after the Battle of Wake Island. So Wake Island, and then in that really small way, made its way into popular culture.
It did. I forgot. Wake On is what when Bruce Willis was a little kid, and he's
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
to Bruce Willis, and you look at that watch, totally different when you see how they got it out of there. Oh my God, that's Pulp Fiction holds up. You want to talk about that, right?
Oh,
You watch it today.
that's a great movie.
Oh my gosh. So I have an 18-year-old son, and some of the movies I loved when I was little, we watched in the 80s. It just doesn't hold up, doesn't hold their attention.
Yeah,
I showed them Pulp Fiction, and they're just like awesome. Just like they watched it.
yeah.
Well, it's so good. You wrote about so many pivotal moments in history, from Lincoln to Patton to Elvis to Muhammad Ali, just so much. The Beatles. What lessons from Midway do you think are most relevant to today? There's someone to take away.
I don't think a lot of people want to hear this. When I think about all the young men, and it was almost universally men, the young men who went to the Pacific, sailed on the ships, flew those airplanes. They had just lived through the 1930s, where they had seen the rise of fascism in Europe, and they had seen the Europeans being deprived of civil liberties. And so they were fighting for democracy and freedom. And I think those guys, when they came home, they knew they had secured democracy. And when you see the fact that we're starting to recreate some of those 1930s totalitarian ideals within our own nation right now and sacrificing some aspects of the Constitution in favor of the same kind of agenda that was perpetuated in Nazi Germany, I think those sailors, when they came home from the war, if they had come home to what we have going on in our country right now, I think they would have been very disoriented. It's just weird to see history repeat itself, but I just never thought it would repeat itself in this way.
One of the quotes I wrote down a couple times, you mentioned there was a sign. It said, "Not goodbye, just see you soon." It captures like the tragic optimism of the young men heading off in the battle who may or may not return. What does a quote like that reveal about the mindset of the people who fought at Midway?
It was full commitment. It was one of those things. If you've ever seen an aircraft carrier up close, they are enormous. They're the biggest things you can imagine. And it's an island. It's a floating small town where thousands of men and now women work and live and fight. And it's hard to imagine as you walk the decks of one of them that such a thing could ever be sent to the bottom of the ocean. They're just so big and so powerful. And when these guys went off to war, they went off to war with the idea that, yeah, I'm on the Enterprise and nothing's going to happen to the Enterprise, or I'm on the Yorktown. The Yorktown got sunk, and it's just one of those things where those guys had a very pragmatic point of view that as formidable as their ship or whatever they were serving on could be, there was a very good chance that something bad could happen to them.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. How about getting back to the creative process? When you write about things that have been written about so much, like Paris, London, Midway, even Lincoln, how do you decide what projects to take on? There's so many flashpoints in history that you could dive into. How do you choose the rabbit hole to go down and write about?
It takes a while. I just finished a new book, and it's a big departure. It's not a war book at all. It's about the running boom of the 1970s and the growth of the marathon. And and immediately I began thinking about what book is next. And the with that book I just finished, it's called The Long Run. That story had never really been told. There have been other books, but not that many. But you take the Battle of Midway, there have been, I don't know, go on Amazon and count it, but probably 1,000 books about Midway. And you could, and I say this at the end in the notes, but you could, it's the same as with Lincoln. You could write a book 5,000 pages long and as exhaustive as you can imagine and still not tell the full story of these battles. So what I do, and I think Paris is the good example, when I did Taking Paris, what I really wanted to do was just talk about the liberation of Paris. But then I realized to get there, I had to go all the way back to the liberation takes place August 26, 1944. Paris falls at the end of May into June 1940. So that's 4 years. So what am I going to do for those 4 years? And there have been books there was a book called Paris is Burning that was about Paris being liberated. I didn't want to do that book. I wanted to do a book that kind of brought people in and told them the bigger picture about the fall of Paris, life in Paris, the resistance, all the things that then went into telling the story of what it was like to be in Paris at that time. I also have to admit that when I choose books, I choose about where can I go. And I sure did want to go to Paris. So that's a good place to research. Taking Berlin, guess what? You get to go all over Europe because that's the battlefield. So that's the fun part of it is it's like, where are we going to go? How are we going to fit a book around it? But then when you write the book, having been there, that informs the story so much. I think that's what helps it rise up off the page. When I was doing Taking Berlin, I was talking about the Bridge Too Far battle, and I'd studied it. I knew what was going on. So when we actually went to Arnhem, my wife and I, and we're driving into the center of the city, and I took a left turn, and she said, "Where are you going? The bridge is right there." I said, "I don't want to go to the bridge. They fought over the bridge. We'll get there soon enough. I want to go to where the paratroopers had to paddle the river, the Meuse River, in these flimsy little boats, and they're saying Hail Marys as they go across, and the Germans on the other side." And I'd studied it enough that I could literally, without a map, drive to that exact location where they put their boats into the water and looked across. And my wife didn't believe me. She said, "How do you know this is the spot?" I said, "This is the spot." And just as we parked, there was a little placard that said, "This is the spot," basically. Cool. So that's how deep the research goes.
Wow, that's so good. And then the Bridge Too Far, that's Operation Market Garden, right? Was that? Yeah, that's no, I remember that book. That book's phenomenal. Do you have any bullets left in the gun for the Killing series? Can you see another one coming out?
No, Bill and I aren't working together anymore. We did because we did the Confronting series, Confronting the Presidents.
Yeah, yeah, that was great. That was fantastic.
Yeah, but it was a big book. It was like a book and a half in a single book.
Yep.
And also we worked together for 15 years. Bill and I are still friends. We still do the Christmas thing and all that kind of stuff. But I just wanted to take my solo path because he's doing another Confronting book that comes out in the fall. So it's fun to do my own thing.
Yeah, that Confronting the Presidents, that was a deep book, and that was, as you said, that's two books in one almost. That's crazy thick, and if you go through each president and what they had to decide. It was a gift I gave my dad for maybe a Christmas, whenever it came out that Christmas. I bought it for him, and it's a phenomenal. It's just a broad sweep of American history. So good. Let's switch over real quick to a part of the interview we call Share Your Secrets, so our listeners can get to know you a little bit more as a person. Martin, it's high achievers like yourself, right? When you got to reset your body, clear your mind, what do you do?
I live in a town that's at the base of a mountain range here in Southern California. My getaway is I either go for a run on the trails or I just go for a long walk on the trails. It just gets me away. I don't bring my phone. I don't listen to podcasts. I just walk. And I got to tell you, at the end of 4 to 6 hours of writing and research, you can feel pretty stupid. So that walk is really invigorating.
And how about when you're in write mode? How many hours a day do you write?
Oh, it's like it depends. At the very start, and I try to get 1,000 words a day, but at the very start of a book, when you don't really know the story that well, I'm lucky to get 200 or 300 words, and that's probably 2 to 3 hours of writing. At the end of a book, finishing the long run like I did last week, it was 8 hours just nonstop. And I know the health. I know you're supposed to stand up and walk around. I know that sitting is bad for you, but when I'm locked in, I don't notice the time flying. So I'll sit there for as long as it takes to get the story told.
That's great. How about authors like yourself are obviously huge readers. Is there a book growing up that influenced you most or changed your mind more than any other?
Growing up, I don't know. I've been a reader since I wasn't a complete nerd. I played Little League, played the base. I wasn't the kid in right field. I could hit, but I love to read. I love to read. And I'm looking over at my own library, and there's a book called, what is it? My Side of the Mountain. It's about this kid who ran away and built a built his own little home, and he's like 12, but he built a home in a tree, and not a tree house, but like literally inside the tree, and learns how to live off the land. For some reason, I thought that was the life I wanted, but it hasn't influenced anything. But I will say that what I read when I'm done, like at the end of the day, after I go out in the woods, very often I'll just read spy thrillers. I've read everything by Jean Le Carré at least twice. I love this guy Mark Greaney and his Gray Man series. I just love things because the action is right there on the page. If the story is told in a really good way, it's just a good reminder for me to just keep the pages flowing so that people want to keep turning the pages.
And that shows up in your work because your work reads like narrative fiction but it's real. I think that's what we appreciate so much when you write something that comes out, it's must read. How about this, Martin? If you could have everyone take just one lesson away from the Battle of Midway and everything we discussed, what would that lesson be?
We haven't even mentioned it yet, but it would be the courage of the pilots. Primarily, you had the torpedo bombers, they had to drop a torpedo. So to drop a torpedo, you have to fly low and parallel to the ocean, probably about 30 to 40 feet off the deck, but at an incredibly slow speed, barely over 100 miles an hour to be completely accurate. And those pilots, almost all were just obliterated. They knew that they were going to get shot down. The Japanese Zero was a much superior aircraft, but they went in and did their job anyway. And then at the same time, you have the dive bomber pilots. And so the dive bombers, imagine a hawk coming down out of 30 feet off the ground, swooping down to get a field mouse. That's what dive bombers did. They're starting at 20,000 feet that day. They dive straight down onto a target and to drop their bombs right on top of the flight deck of those Japanese vessels and to explode them took tremendous courage because you talk about full commitment. The minute that they start going in, there's no pulling out. It was pretty fantastic.
The courage those people must have is just
Yeah.
unbelievable. Just absolutely unbelievable. Crazy. How about this? Two fun questions, Martin, to wrap everything up. First one, we asked this of all the guests at the end. Martin, if you could spend a day with anyone, famous, not famous, alive or dead, who would you spend the day with?
Jesus is the easy answer. So let's just put that
Okay.
there. That's it. Who would you have dinner with? Three people. You got a lot of questions for Jesus, but without a doubt, it'd be Bruce Springsteen. So
Awesome.
yeah, I would love to talk creativity and the written word and all that stuff with Springsteen because so much of what I do he was foundational to my creative growth.
What's your favorite Springsteen album?
Oh, Darkness on the Edge of Town,
Oh, so good. So good. How about what's your favorite song from the album?
Badlands.
Badland. Oh, that's so good. Did you ever see the Tonight Show clip? It might be 10th Avenue Freeze. He was on Jimmy Fallon, and his kid, one of his boys, got to middle school. This is like years ago, and they were saying that his kids didn't really know he's not cool to his kids. And then one day, his kid is like middle school age, comes back and said, "Dad, what's 10th Avenue Freeze Out? My friends were talking about it." And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "Can you play it for me?" So Bruce gets his guitar and plays a couple lines. And his son looks at him and just says, it's not bad. It's like, "Yeah, it's okay. It's okay." Like it's
I
so,
love that.
it's so
Yeah.
funny. You're never the idol of your kid. After 10 years
Um,
old, you're not the idol of your kids anymore.
I guarantee you, none of my kids have read a single book I've written. Not one.
Makes me
Yeah.
feel so good.
Yeah.
Your books are a billion times more popular than this podcast. And I couldn't get my dad to listen or like sometimes my wife to listen. I'll have like great guests on. I'm like, oh, I got this person on. God, and listen, yeah, like I'm dying. So
Yeah. Yeah.
funny.
I get it.
And kids
You're
don't
not
listen at all. How about that last question? Martin, if you had to get a quote or a saying tattooed on your body, what would that quote or motto say?
Let's see. I would say be present, be grateful, and do hard things.
Wow. Be present, be grateful, and do hard things. That is awesome. And I think that is about as good as a spot as any to wrap this up. The guest is Martin Dugard, the author of the Taking Midway and Taking Berlin and Taking Paris and the Killing series. And coming up at the long run, is that your next work?
Yeah, the long run. April
April.
26th.
Any chance we could have you back next spring to
I
talk the
would,
book?
I would love it. I would
That would
love
be
it.
amazing. Martin, if people are looking for you and all your amazing books and work
Yeah.
online, where can we find you?
Go to my website, martindugard.com. And I think I'm on Instagram and I'm on X. I still want to call it Twitter, but I'm just at Martin Dugard.
Gotcha. What I'll do is I'll put your Instagram, your Twitter, and your website and link to the book on in the show notes. Definitely pick up a copy of Taking Midway, epic history told in such an amazing readable style. But Martin, I'd like to thank you for joining us. Thank you for all your amazing work. Admired your work from afar for such a long time, and just an honor to speak with you, sir.
Yeah, Joe, thanks for having me on. It was really great. I really
Uh,
had a good time.
Martin, thank you so much. It was so awesome to speak with you. You're awesome.
Cool. I love, is it a backdrop or is that your actual,
Yeah, this is, so I take Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and there's my mat. I train in the background and my sons and I train in our mat back here.
I love it. That looks really cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
When I'm out in LA, I usually go to the Gracie Academy up in LA in Torrance. I train up with those guys every now and then. That's great.
All right.
Thank you, Martin. Have a great day. Appreciate you.
Thanks.